All right, everybody, I'm very excited to present this enrichment to you because it's all about my favorite animals of all time, the jellyfish. So we're drifting into that magical world of gelatinous animals that really don't look anything like animals. And we've been spending a lot of time over the summer talking about empathy as a tool to connect our guests to the animals and then to our mission. And that's really easy when you're talking about sea turtles and penguins and otters, all this charismatic megafauna. But it's really hard to connect to something that looks like that because it has no eyes, it's brainless, it's heartless, it's spineless. But after that, you probably know a person that's like that in your life, maybe? Yeah. But these animals are weird, they're wonderful, they're gooey, they go with the flow. So we're talking about jumpin' jellyfish because I'm a child of the 90s and Little Mermaid, Sebastian said that, and it's just like that tagline that sticks in my brain. So we're moving on and talking about the intangibles of jellyfish. When you hear the word jellyfish, what does it inspire to your mind? What words do you think of? And as you're starting to contemplate that, I'm going to pass around some jars, jelly jars, because Gabrielle in the Discovery Lab is amazing and has samples of every single animal you could possibly imagine. Now, please do not spill the liquid that's inside. It is not meant to be spilled. It will be something you don't want on your hands. But these are deep sea jellies from Mbari, from mid-water trawls. So you'll be seeing some cool things in there. But I'm hoping that these inspire you further with words. So just call out. What are some words that come to mind when you hear jellyfish?
Finding Nemo.
Finding Nemo.
Space animals.
Space animals.
They
They hurt getting so okay. Pain. Pain is a great intangible for them.
Aliens.
Aliens, yeah, definitely.
Mass migration.
Mass migration, that vertical migration, very good. Autonomous.
That zen feeling, like looking at a campfire, but it's...
Zen, so you feel chilled out when you're looking at the. I mean, squishy, yeah.
I think kind of spooky.
Spooky.
Because they have 8 eyes, they can see you and they can follow you.
Mm-hmm. Spooky jellies. They do. Yeah, we'll talk about that. Anything else? Come to mind. Sorry?
Go with the flow.
Go with the flow. Chilled out. I feel like jellyfish are the mascot for Santa Cruz after the banana slugs. They're so relaxed, man. I think about how they are mostly water, right? What happens to a jelly when you take all the water away? These animals are over 90% water. I've actually heard up to 97% water. I have a jar right here with some dehydrated jellies, and basically if you opened this and blew, like just dust would go everywhere. There's not very much left to them afterwards, so lots of minerals in there. Any other words that come to mind with jellies? Imagine standing in front of the Drifters Gallery or looking at our jelly webcam. How would you feel? Peaceful. Definitely, that's a good intangible. So these are very different feelings from empathy than what you normally get. We look at turtles and we think, oh, maybe love or family and all that. You don't really think family when you see a jellyfish, but you feel these other things like beauty, wonder, awe. And these are skills that you can use, that you can actually build off of when you're talking to the guests. So, how do you say jellyfish? There are many, many languages. I took a few and I looked them all up. I love kurage in Japanese for jellyfish, medusa in Spanish, Italian, and even Russian, and Portuguese. But my favorite is the other way of saying jellyfish in Portuguese, which is agua viva, which is literally living water, because you kind of feel like if you waved a magic wand over seawater, it would come to life as a jellyfish, being about 97% water. And one of the most important pieces of interpretation for jellyfish is that when you're talking about these animals with people and you mention that they're animals, you have to stop there because you're going to leave your audience behind. This doesn't look like an animal to most people. They're thinking that this is maybe vegetable, mineral, I don't know, but they don't think about it as an animal. So what defines an animal? Well, the kingdom Animalia, there's very few things you need to be inside. You need to be multicellular, you reproduce, you react to some sort of stimulus in your environment, you eat in order to gain energy, and sometimes you move, but not always. So that's all you really need to be an animal. So once you define that to people, you're like, this is definitely an animal. They pulse, but they go with the flow. They are drifters. They are definitely plankton. They cannot swim against the current. They go wherever the current takes them. They are gelatinous. The gelatinous structure inside a jellyfish is called mesoglia, which is a complex that's made up of mostly water, amino acids, fats, and collagen, actually. So it really does feel like jello when you play with the jellyfish. And I've played with many jellyfish. As a Jellies volunteer for 3 years, I've been stung by every single species of jelly in that gallery. They are mostly water, and it's funny, when you talk about jellies, they're kind of loosely organized water. And they're typically cnidarians, which are animals that are characterized by stinging cells. However, some people like to put other things into jellyfish, all the gelatinous drifters. So they're thinking about the comb jellies or the ctenophores, or they'll put salps in there, or they put pteropods, the sea butterflies. Anything that's gooey and goes with the flow, they kind of throw in there. But typically here at the aquarium, when we're talking about our jellyfish, we're thinking of the ones that pulse and could potentially sting us, which is why that fun universal pain is associated with them. So before we go too far, I know it's been a while since some of you have taken guide class, and for some of you who haven't taken guide class yet with regards to cnidarians. So let's just define that really quickly. So we have kingdom Animalia, we have the phylum Cnidaria, characterized by having cnidocytes, stinging cells. And then we have 4 classes that fall into that phylum. So the first one is Anthozoa, and I'm kind of an etymology nerd. I totally love breaking words down. So anthos in Greek means flower, and zoea means animal. So they're the flower animals. So if you look closely at a coral, you'll see these beautiful little polyps. They look like flowers. You look at any of your anemones, they look like flowers. That's where they got their name from. And when you are interpreting an anemone to a guest, they're usually more familiar with a jellyfish, the cousin. So I always say, oh, this is an anemone. You probably saw it in Finding Nemo. It's basically like a jelly on a stick. You turn your jellyfish upside down, its tentacles are up, and it's pulling food into its mouth. It's a bag. The mouth is also the anus, which is a lot of fun to interpret to kids because they start cracking up. It's like the best thing they've ever heard, and parents are really grossed out by it. But it's a lot of fun to talk about it like that. When you touch an anemone, what happens? Like a green anemone, what's happened to your hands? It's sticky. And it's really funny because you're thinking, oh, it's glue-like. What's actually happening is there's tons of stinging cells that are releasing harpoons into your flesh and envenomating you, but you can't feel it. That's why you should never lick an anemone.
So, like, if you pull away, does that mean you're ripping the stingers out?
Yeah, actually, after they fire, they don't, you get a new stinging cell that comes into being after that. So that organelle is only released once. So you're pulling away those little harpoons, and we'll get a better graphic on this later. But yes, never lick an anemone, never rub your eyes after you've touched an anemone. You're just rubbing harpoons and venom into all your soft bits. Hydrozoa. This class is really interesting. You probably know the Portuguese man-of-war, which is a colony that drifts around, a colony of stinging animals, and there's reproductive structures in there too, so every animal that's attached has a different role. Another colonial hydrozoan is the by-the-wind sailors, which is more common to when we have a warm water flow through here. We'll get the by-the-wind sailors. You've probably seen this weird fuzz in the nature center. That's also a hydrozoan. Weird fuzz in Monterey Bay habitats, also hydrozoan. So they can be stalked animals that sit in one place. Their medusa form or their jellyfish form would be like teeny tiny. They look like itty bitty shower caps floating around, and then they release their gametes, and then you get the stalking bit again. Some of them are exclusively just in that sedentary stage, and then some have jelly forms that look like your typical jellyfish. So what's weird about these, the crystals and the cross jellies, you will find these in our drifters gallery in the window that has the light switch where you can turn it off. So that's where you find these. And I remember I was working with Tommy Knowles, who's like the jelly wizard, and I was working in the morning, and I thought there was something wrong with this exhibit because all the jellies looked messed up. And when jellies look messed up, like they have what we call bell erosion, like a hole in them, or they look broken, torn in half, something's wrong with them, we call them losers. Those are the losers on exhibit. We have to take the losers back and behind the scenes. The golden children are the beautiful ones that we put in front of the scene. So I said, oh my God, this exhibit is full of losers. We got to get rid of them. We got to go get some golden children. And he starts laughing at me. He says, they're actually all eating. And I was like, what do you mean? Well, when you look at these animals, they don't have those big, lacy oral arms that we're used to seeing on jellyfish. Think about your Pacific sea nettle, the orange ones with the big, lacy bits in the middle. So that actually helps to pull food in towards the bell. If you don't have those, if you only have tentacles around your bell, how do you get food into the middle where your mouth is? You have to fold in half like a taco. So that's why all of these look broken. They're collecting up all of the brine shrimp larvae on the tentacles, reeling it into the middle, and then they collapsed in half. And that's why I thought they were all messed up. So it's really interesting. That's something that you can interpret to our guests. This is how these animals eat. These weird animals. And then, of course, you have to go back and be like, yes, these are animals, indeed. Now, class Cubozoa is probably one of my favorites, and you've probably had someone ask you about this at some point. Where are the box jellies? Because everyone has heard about the most venomous animal on the planet, the Australian box jelly. You get in the water, you get stung, you die. Yeah, it's pretty intense. We have had box jellies on exhibit. When we had Jellies Experience, we had these teeny tiny adorable mangrove box jellies. Not the ones that will kill you, just, relatives. What's interesting about box jellies, they also don't have oral arms. They are square. They're actually much better swimmers than the other jellyfish because of that square body. They are better hunters even without a brain. They're really good hunters because they have 4 well-developed eyes, so they can actually form images in their nerve net even though they don't have a brain. It's kind of crazy. And the reason that the Australian box jelly has such a strong sting is because it's eating solid prey. Now, if you're like 97% water, you don't want solid prey like a fish in your body thrashing around because you'll die. So you have to murder it before you bring it up into your body. So that's why they have the really strong sting. So a lot of guests will ask if we've had this, and you could say we've had a relative, the mangrove box jelly, but some are insistent. I've heard that you've had the Australian box jelly at the Monterey Bay Aquarium, and that has to do with a movie by Will Smith, which Will Smith starred in. Has anyone seen 7 Pounds? Yeah, 7 Pounds has like this CGI bit of the Monterey Bay Aquarium. They're like, I was at the Monterey Bay Aquarium as a child and I saw the box jelly, and you get to see our big chrysal that usually has the Pacific nettles and is full of these box jellies that don't look anything like box jellies. It's really weird. But that might be what they're thinking of. So context for all of you. And then we have class Cyphozoa. This is what we are watching on the jelly cam. We are chilling out and we're seeing the Pacific nettles cruising by. We're seeing their beautiful purple striped jellies, and what characterizes class Cyphozoa is having these oral arms in addition to the tentacles. So we'll talk a little bit about anatomy and why that's so important. Now please, ooh and ah, I made this in PowerPoint somehow. Like I added all these shapes. Oh, thank you. Thank you. It's really, you know how hard it is to draw on a computer. It's like really difficult. So thank you. Thank you. Stinging bag of water. So this is your classic Cyphozoan right here. You have your single opening, the mouth and the anus all in one, so food goes in and waste comes out of the same place. I had a professor at UC Davis who called it the Moanus, a beautiful name. You have your beautiful bell right here, and that's what I think of when I think about Finding Nemo, how Dory and Marlin bounced upon the tops of the bells of a jellyfish and they didn't get stung. There are stinging cells even on the top of the bell of a jellyfish. If you see a jellyfish on the beach, don't pick it up. You're just going to get stung a whole bunch. You have your stomach, which is a big kind of bag in the middle. You have your gastric pouches, which further break down the food. So if you've ever seen a moon jelly, you'll see the little craters of the moon are being filled with pink, and that's them eating, so they're digesting that. On the ends of the gastric pouch, you have the gonad. So you can actually see when they're becoming reproductive, because it's not pink with food, but it starts to just look thick and dark. So it's either sperm packets or eggs, depending on whether it's a male or female, because separate sexes exist in jellyfish. And then we have the sensory structures right here. Ropalia for plural, but it's a ropalium. So that's going to see light and dark and tell you if you're upside down or right side up. And you can actually see that on our jellyfish on exhibit. Then you have your tentacles, which are the shoestringy bits. And then you have the oral arms. And the oral arms are like long, lacy lips. They are an extension of the gastric cavity. So when we feed our jellyfish with a turkey baster full of krill, the tentacles will start to shrink up and they're moving towards the oral arms. The oral arms start to shrink up and move towards the stomach. There is some ciliary action that'll move the food up to the bell, but it's mostly just kind of retracting. And it's really important to define these different pieces to our guests to help them identify, oh, this is an animal, this is how it works. Otherwise, they're looking at these jellies and they're just like weird lampshades floating around on exhibit. So there's more to see in this. So the ropalium is something that you can point out to our guests on like a purple striped jelly. It's that little divot. And do you see all these freckles right here? All these bumps? It looks like pimples almost. Those are all batteries of nematocysts on top of the bell. So that's another reason that you don't touch the top of the bell. But there's the ropalium, it's a little dimple right there. It's easier to point out on the moon jellies. So when you're in that gallery and you're interpreting, you want to point out the big moon jellies, the Aurelia labiata in the big circle. And you'll see what looks like a little folded bean or like a little ear. And then 2 scallops later, you'll find another one. So there are 8 of them. And they're really cool. This is your eye spot. So this is how you can see light and dark as a jellyfish. It's also where you have a gyroscope. There's this little bit in there. It's called a statocyst, which is a circle and it's full of these little hairs. And there's a statolith, which is like a little grain of sand that rolls back and forth. And as it touches the hair, it lets you know, oh, I'm right side up, I'm upside down. So that's how that gyroscope works for them. So that's the only sensory structure in a jellyfish. And it's really easy to point out to our guests, and you get so many points when you point that out to them. And then there's the birds and the bees of jellyfish. Guests really like to know if it's a male or female, and most times you really can't tell with jellyfish. But with the moon jellies, it's easier because the females will brood their eggs on their oral arms. So what you're looking for is chewing gum wadded up in the oral arms, kind of like this, that purple chewing gum. And that's how you know that she's brooding eggs. It's either purple or white or kind of a lavender color. The males, you really can't tell unless they're releasing a sperm strand, which looks like just a really long, fine tentacle. It'll be in there for probably about 5 minutes, and then all the other jellies will bump into it and pull it into their gastric cavities, only having fertilization if it's a female. So you're looking for chunky stuff. Usually if it's pink chunky stuff, it's food. So just look for that lavender or white. There are a ton that are reproductive right now. So you could go up there and interpret this immediately today. So here's how the life cycle works. Most jellies, they just broadcast spawn out sperm and egg into the water. You get a planula larva that develops from them. With the moon jelly, the female broods the planula larva on her arms, and then she releases them. And the planula larvae are like Tic Tacs, microscopic Tic Tacs that have hairs all over them. So they swim and they eventually fall, they land on a hard surface, and they develop into something that looks like an anthozoan. So it looks like a little teeny tiny adorable anemone. It's called a polyp. And it sits there and it grows, it has tentacles hanging out, it gets bigger and bigger. And then, be very vague with this step, a series of perfect environmental conditions ensue, and then this animal starts to clone itself. It is really hard for us to pinpoint exactly what it is. It is light exposure, so seasonality. It is the temperature of the water. It's the pH, the salinity. It's that there's enough food in the water. I had a polyp culture, and I could never get it to strobolate. They were just laughing at me the entire time. They're like, we're not going to reproduce for you, so I would just cry. Tommy is much better at kind of gauging what they need. Sometimes we just stress them, and that gets them to strobolate, but we have some polyp cultures that haven't strobolated in like a decade or more. They just sit there laughing at us. But eventually they do strobolate, and that's when they clone themselves by splitting along the top, so like a stack of pancakes sitting there. And then eventually you get a little ephyra that buds off. They're all clones of each other, so you know, if this is the Rachel polyp, little Rachels are flowing away from them, so they're all female. And then eventually all those little petals fuse together and you get your jellyfish. Now, your jellyfish out in the wild, and everybody wants to know how long they live. Jellyfish out in the wild only live for about a year in that Medusa stage. You're being tossed by waves, you can be eaten by a mola or a turtle, but your polyp stage can live for a couple decades or more. We have some cultures that are that old or older. It's really amazing. So if you want to be in this tiny stage, you can live for a very, very long time. And you can clone yourself not just by strobolating, but by sending out little runners, like strawberries. And then from these runners, you get another polyp that pops up. Or you could just walk away and leave behind what's called a podocyst, just like leaving your foot behind, and that pops up into another polyp. So they can just clone themselves a bunch of different ways, which is fascinating. And the immortal jelly just cheats death altogether. So if it gets injured in this jelly stage, the Medusa stage, it will reduce itself down to a cyst, settle down as a polyp, and just live for eternity. Because that's what jellyfish do. Yes?
Can you give us a time frame on that cycle?
No, I can't, because over in here, this could be months or decades. So it's really hard to tell because there's so many factors that go into the strobilation process. I mean, from here to here is usually just like a week or less, just going from the larva to settling down as a polyp. And then growing from like little jelly to big jelly, that could be like 3 or 4 months. And it really depends on how much food is in the area. But the strobilation process, incredibly variable. Yes?
The baby jellies, once they start separating, do they have like those arm-like things? Do they fuse together or something?
Yeah, so eventually you get that umbrella. So those little petals will fuse together, and I have a better picture. So these are all your polyps right here. This is strobilating, and then you can see all these beautiful little polyps or petals, and you can see the ropalia right here, the little eye spot, which is cool. And then this adorable little pulsing creature on the side. Isn't that pretty? All right, so the next thing for jellyfish, of course, stinging cells. And everybody wants to know about stinging cells and why it hurts when you touch a jellyfish. So stinging cells are all over a jellyfish, but they're more concentrated on the oral arms and the tentacles. You can see all the little pimples right here. Those are full of what are called cnidocytes. And your cnidocyte is a pressurized cell. It has this little hair trigger right here, so you can mechanically stimulate one of these things to pop open, or they also have a chemical sensor on them. So this is what keeps a jellyfish from stinging its fellow jellyfish. So if you're the same species, you're not going to be triggered. Oh, you smell like me, that's cool. Oh, I'm a purple striped jelly and you smell like a moon jelly, I'm totally going to sting you and eat you. That's what they do. So this right here, you can see, is tissue. So this would be my hand reaching into the purple striped jelly exhibit. It's the only time I got like an awful rash all the way up my arm. So what happens is, probably poked the trigger, and also it smells that I am not like it. So it fires out the structure called a nematocyst, a nematocyst. And it's a harpoon on the end, a long whip-like hollow tube. So it's like a hypodermic needle that starts pumping venom into you, and that's why you get that rash. That's why you're in so much pain. So it's really fun. We have jelly. There are aquariums that have jelly touch pools, and even on our Jellies tour, we have a jelly touch pool. And that's happening to everyone. You're touching it, and thousands of nematocysts are firing into you, and you're being envenomated. But it depends on the jelly, how strong the sting is. The way to stop the sting, how do you do it? Alcohol could work. Vinegar is the appropriate way to do it. Meat tenderizer, yeah. Who's heard the awful one? Urine. Pee is a terrible thing to do. It's just the worst thing ever. So imagine your friend is getting stung. They're like, I just had a Portuguese man of war. Well, if somebody peed on them too, I mean, their day is just completely ruined. They're being peed on, they've been stung, their life is horrible. But another horrible thing is happening because urine, the pH of urine is closer to neutral, like 7, and ocean water is more like 8.5, more basic. So you're rapidly changing the pH. So all of those stinging cells that are now embedded in your skin start firing even more. So you've been stung, you're being peed on, you're being stung more, your whole day is ruined. So instead, what you're supposed to do is use something like vinegar, a weak acid that will actually stop that. And it's kind of like a clotting reaction. And then use something like a credit card, and you start to flick so that you can get all these harpoons dislodged from your flesh. Very important to know. That's what it looks like. It's the fastest cellular reaction in the animal kingdom. It's like 15 meters per second, which is really cool. It's very fast, and then you just have these harpoons stuck in you. It's awesome. Everyone should have the experience of being stung by a jellyfish at least once. So, other jellies out there are many different kinds. This one is kind of horrifying because you can see the diver could like sit on top of that one. And this is actually very closely related to us. So we'll talk about that in a minute. So there are ctenophores, which are the beautiful comb jellies. They're defined by having teens, or these cilia that run along their body. They diffract white light and they bounce it into a rainbow spectrum. They're not really creating light. Some are bioluminescent, but they're not very bright. And the way that they collect food is not with a stinging cell. That's why they're not cnidarians. They use sticky cells called colloblasts. So they stick to their food, and in the case of the sea gooseberry, you twirl around like a fork in spaghetti. You're getting food from your rear end, which is where your tentacles are, to your mouth. I feel like these are much more developed than jellyfish because they do actually have an anal pore. So they're very highly advanced, these jellies. But you can see when they've eaten because their gut becomes highlighted with food. Some of these non-stinging jellies, these comb jellies, will actually eat stinging jellies. They eat moon jellies, which I think is really neat. So if you go over to the spotted comb jelly exhibit, the Leucothea, you'll actually see these weird chunks of white floating around in there, and that's moon jelly that's been diced up for them to eat. Really cool. And then we have our cousins. Maybe looks like a family member to you, right? So we've got the salps in here, salp chains. They are related very closely to tunicates, but they're drifting tunicates basically. You saw there's that massive one, which is really cool, and a diver could sit on it, but they're all related to us because they are in the phylum Chordata. We're in Chordata because we had a notochord, and our notochord developed into our nerve cord, which is what our spine is wrapped around. Their notochord actually was a tail. They were kind of like tadpoles when they were larvae, and that absorbed down, and then they turned into these weird barrel things. So these are other jellies that will be floating around out there, but not stinging. I think it's weird because they are very closely related to us and they look like slime. Yeah. And then you have to think about conservation with jellyfish. It's very straightforward with other animals, like the planet's warming, this is bad for turtles because they have the sex determination by temperature, so you see more females. It's like very clear. With jellyfish, as oceans warm and other animals disappear, the jellies go, woo, party, and they make more jellies. When ocean acidification happens and other animals start to fail, jellies are very successful. As climate change happens, the jellies are taking over the ocean. And when you think about that, that is a terrifying idea, to go to the beach and just have an ocean full of jellies. This is obviously a system that is out of balance. So I really think about them as an indicator species, or the canary in the coal mine. When you see lots of jellies, there's a problem. There's something going on. And eventually, it's not going to be good for the jellies either, because the things that they eat, the plankton that they're eating, they're going to be experiencing ocean acidification, and their shells will be wearing away, so they won't have anything to eat after a while. So we want that ocean imbalance. We want to see just enough jellies for everything to work nicely. We don't want to see something like this. It's kind of horrifying. And then the other part of conservation for jellyfish is that they look a lot like plastic bags. So that's a problem for sea turtles. Some seabirds like to eat jellyfish. I mean, there's not much to a jellyfish, but they can be kind of nutritious. I feel like it's like eating a vitamin. But as these animals are finding more and more plastics out in the wild and not getting jellyfish, that's a huge problem. And this ties very nicely to the legislation that we're trying to get passed right now. So you could talk about the circular economy bill with relation to jellyfish and them being mistaken, having mistaken identity, people looking at plastic instead. So when you're out on the floor, where can you talk about jellyfish? Besides the Drifters Gallery, where else could you talk about jellyfish? Yeah, at Tiny Drifters. Where else? Get creative. Where are some of their cousins living in the aquarium? Monterey Bay habitats, right. Yeah, you could talk about sea pens. Even in Viva Baja, you have a ton of corals there. And even in the Welcome area, where there are jelly tubes that they just talked about. Yeah.
The wave crash zone, because that's where I talk about how the aquarium has a giant intake pipe.
Oh, yeah.
And it's clogged with jellies.
That's actually very creative. I like that.
If like climate change basically happens, then there'd be the age of the jellies. So then that would be just creating more and more problems.
That's a great story. The age of the jellies and our intake pipe and bringing in, like having to shut down our system basically as jellies are coming in. That's good. I hadn't even thought about that one. So how are you engaging guests with these drifting animals? What's a good starter? What's like a grabbing fact? Someone's staring at the jellyfish and zenning out. What's a fact that you could share with them that might like bring them into a good conversation? Yeah.
There's one jellyfish that's immortal.
Yeah, the immortal jellyfish. That's a great one. What else? Yeah.
It had 8 eyes.
8 eyes. That's a good one. What else? I know some of you were awake and listening. Yeah.
Wasn't the aquarium the first to ever get jellies to reproduce?
Yeah, for many jellies, we've closed the life cycle, and the purple striped jelly was one of the first.
Jellies are pretty recent, right?
Yeah, comb jelly is very recent, so you could talk about culturing here. So that's a great way to engage.
The general life cycle.
Yeah, life cycle, absolutely. Yeah.
I do actually like to tie in the conservation now. We don't always want to take animals from the wild, and we want to try to see if we can get them to reproduce here.
Yeah.
So that we're not just take.
I like that too.
Yeah.
how we can culture in-house and we're not taking from the ocean. It's a really good
They
one.
like their environment, they're being well taken care of.
Yeah, and some of our jellies are living 8 times as long as they would in the wild because we are feeding them and they have nothing to bump into. So connecting guests to our mission through conservation, you inspire them with that fun fact, you reel them in, and then you could talk about that circular economy bill or reducing our use of fossil fuels. And I think empathy is a great tool. You could talk about how wondrous it is to look at this weird floating lampshade, and then you could talk about the bits of the lampshade and move forward from that. But there's this quote in the Jellies gallery, and it's probably one of my favorites. It's jellyfish. The sea offers up flowers of glass like thick light. They are transparent landscapes. So these really do inspire a lot of poetry in us. And if you can build off of that in a guest, the feeling that they have when they look at jellyfish, you can actually deliver a really powerful message. So that's it for Jellies. We're going to drift on across the street now. Thank you all.